This week's story is about a student who's driven insane by brain experiments carried out by a professor at his university. This story was inspired in part by the real-life story of a notorious murderer. Maybe you can guess who when you're listening to the story, and if not, well, I'm going to tell you at the end. I'm going to have to change and redact some names in this account for the sake of plausible deniability, although if you were living in the UK in the 1990s, you'll no doubt guess who and where I'm talking about. The death of Professor B made the national newspapers at the time, but it was blamed on contaminated chemicals improperly stored, and I've always found that curious. To me, the evidence all points to murder, but perhaps that conclusion happens to suit no one. I arrived at the University of N, fresh-faced and eager to learn, in 1991. These days the town is full of rich Americans, coffee bars and open-top sports cars, but in those days N was a quiet town where nothing much happened. For the students there was a disco once a week and not much else. The University of N was widely claimed to be a repository for rejects from Oxford and Cambridge. But Edward wasn't an Oxbridge reject, and neither was I. We had both chosen the university on sound logical principles, and we had that in common. Ed had chosen it because it was as far away from his parents as it was possible to get and still study the type of philosophy that he liked, while I had chosen it because it was by the sea. When I arrived at N, I was surprised to find I was expected to share a room. I hadn't looked into it properly at all, and if I had known, I wouldn't have gone there. I count myself fortunate to have been shoved in with Ed though, in spite of subsequent events. We were both quiet, withdrawn people, finding it hard to really blend in with the great mass of students and their parties. Ed had a thick shock of blonde hair, almost down to his shoulders, and he looked like he wanted to audition for an 80s rock band. I thought him wickedly funny, but he also had a slightly bitter and serious side to him, which, however, wasn't very pronounced most of the time. Not at first. Far too many people attend university these days, I remember Ed saying, not long after I'd met him. Do you know, there are even people here studying management? What a joke. A degree has become nothing other than a certificate of being middle class. The entire education system is now little more than a pyramid scheme. You might think him a snob, but he said everything in such a disarming way that not even management students could have taken offence. He was simply a massive eccentric, and modern life was not built for the likes of him. It was in the second year that the problems began. I didn't see as much of Ed as previously, since by then I'd moved in with some friends and his parents had bought him a small flat on the edge of town. That place was a wonder to behold. It was housed in a respectable building of Edwardian construction, but inside it was a bizarre melange of oriental wall hangings, Victorian-era scientific apparatus purchased from a dozen different obscure antique shops, and old wooden and marble figurines from all over the world. None of it, I suspected, really worth much in monetary terms, but all of it a startling reflection of Ed's strange character. One day I was round at Ed's attempting to smoke a Turkish pipe filled with some disgusting Eastern tobacco that he insisted I try, and he said, "I've enrolled in Professor B's study." "Oh," I said. "What's he studying?" "The brain," said Ed. "He's got a sort of machine that fits around your head and creates enormous magnetic fields, very tightly focused. Then he asks you questions. Half an hour later you walk out 20 quid the richer. You know Stephen M? He's already done it, and he says it's easy money." "I didn't think you were too bothered about money," I replied. "Isn't your father rich?" "He may be rich, but I'm not," he said. "I have to pay for all my own food now, and that adds up." "Well, you should buy cheaper food," I said. If I can make my grant cover it, I'm sure you can manage somehow. Why don't you enrol too, he said. If you do one session a week, that's over £80 a month, not to be sniffed at. Isn't it dangerous, I said. I don't want my brain fried. Not at all, he said. I'll say this about Ed. He had one big fault that can't be entirely chalked up to mere eccentricity. Ed and truth were complete strangers. He chose his words based on whether he found them entertaining or not on whether they represented factual reality. Whatever they were teaching him on his philosophy course, it wasn't the importance of being truthful. In view of this clear fact, I should have been more wary of Professor B. Ed didn't even know anything much about science, although he pretended to know everything. How was he to know if Professor B's machine harmed the brain or not? At the time I didn't think this through properly. All I could think about was £80 a month. To me, at that time, that was a small fortune. That was the kind of money where I could potentially buy music tapes and eat out once or twice a month. The next day I went to the psychology lab to enrol in the study. The woman who took my details told me they were having trouble getting people to enrol, which surprised me greatly considering the money involved. She emphasised that while I could leave the study at any time I chose and still get paid, they were ideally looking for people who would stick it out for at least a month. All of this seemed quite outlandish to me and set me wondering if my fellow students weren't all much wealthier than myself, as I had long suspected, or if there was some unpleasant aspect of the study that had thus far remained hidden to me. It turned out to be mainly the latter. It somehow happened that I was called upon to take part before Ed, which was probably just because my surname was lower in alphabetical order than his. The experiments were taking place in the basement of the psychology building, which was a very pleasant old building, probably several hundred years old. When I arrived, I had some trouble locating Professor B, but eventually I was directed to a room at the end of a long, dark corridor. When I stepped inside, I was immediately somewhat shocked. There was Professor B buzzing about in a lab coat, grey-haired and clean-shaven, with the jawline of a football player or a Hollywood actor, but the entire room was dominated by a vast and grotesque machine. The machine was largely white in colour, as if attempting to appear harmless in the way that hospital equipment often does, with grey panels here and there. It consisted of 3 parts, each enormous, and each culminating in a blunt point the size of a fist, with all 3 directed at the head of a dentist's chair, 2 at either side and 1 behind. "Are you here for the experiment?" said the professor coldly. I was so shocked that I didn't at first reply. He saw me eyeing the machine in horrified amazement and said, "No need to worry, it's quite harmless. All of this is simply needed to generate strong magnetic fields. Biological matter is quite insensitive to electromagnetic radiation, in spite of what some would have you believe, so we need a lot of it to obtain any effect at all." An elderly woman, also in a lab coat, seemed to materialise from nowhere and proffered a clipboard containing a consent form and a pen. I looked at the form. It was full of dense text and several phrases jumped out at me. Things like epileptiform seizures, brain hemorrhage, and swelling of the brainstem. "It's a standard form," said the woman, with an insincere and unpractised attempt at a smile. "You can read it later at home." "We'd really appreciate your help," said Professor B. "We're finding it hard to recruit people on account of Bertha's rather disturbing experience." "Bertha?" I said. "That's what we call the apparatus," he said. Somehow I found myself signing the consent form. It wouldn't be true to say that he convinced me to do it. It was more that I felt pressured. At that age I was easily pushed around. I felt it would be embarrassing to refuse. I didn't want to waste his time or seem lacking in bravery. How ironic, really. The brave thing to do would have been to walk out of there, or at least have insisted on carefully reading the consent form. The woman pushed me gently towards the seat, which I approached with an absolute feeling of doom. I can't explain why exactly. It wasn't just the size and monstrous appearance of the thing, nor even the alarming phrases on the consent form, but rather the whole atmosphere of the place. Nothing in there was reassuring. They sat me down and fixed a band around my head, which had various sensors attached to it. "I almost forgot to ask," said the professor. "Do you have any metal implants?" "No," I replied. "No earrings, piercings?" he said, peering at me. "No." "Good," he said. "You don't look the type, but these days you never know. Empty your pockets, please." The woman held out a metal tray and I deposited a few coins and bits of paper into it. "I have a metal belt buckle," I said, suddenly thinking of it. "That'll be fine," he said, "as long as it's not loose." "Will it hurt?" I said, and I felt ashamed that I couldn't keep the quaver out of my voice. "No, not at all," said Professor B. "Not in the least. Just relax. Once the machine is on, Edith will ask you some questions. Simply answer whatever first comes to your mind. We'll be finished in 20 to 30 minutes. I lay back in the chair with my heart pounding, the business ends of 3 vast machines pressed gently against my skull, the band tight around my forehead, while the professor flipped switches and adjusted dials. The machines started to make a discordant clanking sound. "You may hear some odd noises," said the professor, which made me wonder if the clanking was real or only in my mind. "Here it comes," he said, and he flipped one final switch. I felt the most tremendous buzzing sensation, which seemed to fill my entire head. The buzzing seemed to invade my visual field, so that the whole laboratory appeared to vibrate and dissolve into squiggly lines, like the screen of a broken old television. Then I saw, with my mind's eye, but with intense vividness, a vast desert plain, upon which sat uncounted strange spherical stones in rows and columns, stretching as far as the eye could see. No sooner had I begun to wonder what I was looking at, than it gave way to a solar system with eyes in place of planets, and then an enormous tangled mass of vines and leaves with thousands of eyes embedded in it. After this, the images in my mind changed so rapidly that I couldn't keep track of them, and the buzzing became unendurable. I can't explain how or why it was so unpleasant, since it wasn't painful, but I wanted nothing more than for it to stop. I tried to leap out of the chair, but I found myself restrained by the headband. When I tried to reach for it, I found my arms almost paralysed and too weak to do anything useful at all. Then I screamed, "Stop! Stop!" But instead of the professor coming to my aid, he seemed to be engaging in obscene and bestial acts with his elderly assistant. They had disrobed and appeared to be injecting each other with something. And then, abruptly, the buzzing ceased, and the professor was removing my headband, fully clothed, thank God, and saying, "Very good. Let me out," I said. "I've changed my mind. I don't want the money." A puzzled expression appeared on the professor's face. "The experiment is finished now," he said. "You've answered all the questions. That's all we need for today." I stood up, rather dizzy. "I answered the questions?" I said. "Yes," said the professor, with a little laugh. To my surprise, I noticed the hands on the cheap plastic clock at the end of the room had indeed moved forward half an hour. "You can collect your payment at the reception on the way out," he said. I bolted out of the door without saying goodbye. He may have shouted something after me, but I paid no attention. I didn't even stop to collect the money. When I got back to the house I shared with my friends, I went straight to the bathroom and alleviated my stomach of its contents. I didn't feel completely myself for at least a month after that. It was clear that much of what I had imagined happened was in fact hallucination, but the hallucinations were caused by the machine, and I hadn't been warned about the possibility of hallucinations at all, unless it was buried somewhere in the dense text of the consent form. Worse than the hallucinations was the terrible buzzing sensation. The only thing I can compare it to is it was like being suffocated while wasps fly up one's nose. It was truly unpleasant. Naturally, I strongly recommended Ed to have nothing to do with it, but I succeeded only in piquing his curiosity. "You survived in one piece, didn't you?" he said. "It can't be that bad." Part of me certainly wondered if I wasn't making too much of it. I'm the sort of person who insists the dentist gives me 3 injections for a filling. Other people might weather the ordeal better than myself, I thought. I was certainly curious to find out what Ed would make of it. I remember it was a Monday when the professor finally called Ed in. I was anxious to speak with him as soon as possible afterwards, but it was Wednesday evening before he agreed to meet me. We went for a walk down past the old graveyard to the sea. We often walked down there in the dark, buying Eccles cakes from a bakery that stayed open all night, or at least the bakers working night shift in the back room were willing to sell things to us students. This time Ed wasn't in the mood for cakes, and to my surprise, he seemed reluctant to talk about his experience with the professor and his study. "I just went in and answered a bunch of stupid questions," he said. "What more is there to say?" "Didn't you feel a huge buzzing sensation in your head?" I asked. "I suppose," he said. "Did you hallucinate?" "I don't think so," he replied. He was almost monosyllabic and seemed to be ruminating on something. "What's up with you today?" I said to him eventually. "Oh, I don't know," he said. "Doesn't this all feel a bit meaningless to you?" "What?" I said. "The whole university thing," he said. "It's a bit of a scam really, isn't it? Most of the students here aren't really all that interested in their subject and don't need it. They just want 3 years of regular parties and a good job at the end." "What's wrong with that?" I said, surprised by the unusual bitterness of his tone. "Universities used to be a sanctuary for the best and brightest," he said. "Now they're young adult creches, destroyed by the jealousy of people who want respect without work or talent." I blew my cheeks out in an expression of exasperation. "Oh, come on, lighten up," I said to him, or something along those lines. "Your blood sugar's probably low. I told you we should have bought Eccles cakes." He ranted on in the same vein for a bit, warming to his theme, and we almost got into an argument. I'd never really argued with Ed before, not seriously. He did lighten up finally when we got to the old pier, but there his behaviour started to alarm me for the first time. I have to explain, the pier was made of stone and there was a part of it that was raised high above the rest. Many people like to walk along this raised bit of the pier, but one had to take a certain amount of care. There were no railings until at the very end, and the fall to the rocks below was probably enough to kill anyone who was unlucky enough to fall off and hit his head. Indeed, it was said that several dozen people had died there over the centuries since its construction, although we had no way of knowing the source or veracity of these claims in those pre-internet days. That night, Ed insisted on positively waltzing along that narrow stone walkway, pirouetting and whooping in delight like an absolute idiot. Several times he nearly slipped off the edge, but try as I might, I couldn't get him to stop. Eventually he got annoyed with me. "Keep your hair on, Grandma," he shouted mockingly, deliberately balancing with one foot on the very edge. "It's not the Grand Canyon." After that I didn't see him again for a couple of weeks. We had 2 lectures in common per week on formal logic, which lies at the intersection of mathematics and philosophy, but I didn't see him there. Neither of us had telephones, but I stopped by his flat and rang the buzzer a couple of times. I don't like to inflict myself on people when I'm not wanted, but he and I had been good friends, and I was worried about him. On my 3rd attempt he finally answered and told me to come up. I was shocked by what I found. The wall hangings were gone, the sculptures were gone, most of his hair was gone. He had shaved it almost to the point where he looked like a skinhead. Instead of the Turkish pipe, I found him smoking cigarettes one after the other, stubbing them out in an overflowing ashtray. "What the devil's happened to you?" I asked. I noticed there were dark circles under his eyes. "What do you mean?" he said. Then he noticed me eyeing the blank walls and he said, "Oh, this? Just felt like a change." "You still doing Professor B's study?" I asked. "Certainly am," he said. "Actually, I think it's opening my mind up, giving me new ideas." "What do you mean?" I said. "Have you ever considered our situation?" he said. "I mean, really considered it." "What situation?" I said. "You mean at the university?" "No," he said. "I mean our actual situation as sentient beings. Do you realise your brain essentially lives in a jar?" "What jar?" I said, smiling, but I saw no trace of a smile on Ed's face. "Your skull," he said. "Your brain spends all of its time in a jar called the skull, and the only information it receives from the outside world consists of odourless, tasteless, colourless nerve impulses, like Morse code." Then he made a noise like a Morse code machine, but the effect was more sinister than comical. "True, I suppose," I said. "No suppose about it," he said. "Your brain takes these nerve signals and makes out of them a world full of colour, scent and texture, and space and time. It's all an invention of your brain." "I don't know that it's all an invention of the brain," I said. "The brain makes a sort of model of the world as I see it. It must be an accurate model or we wouldn't be able to survive in the world." He leaned forward in his chair and fixed me with a slightly bloodshot stare that seemed to go straight through me. "How do you know you are surviving?" he said. "It's all an experience, Joe. Love, hate, space, time, it's all just an experience." "So, are you still attending lectures?" I said, changing the subject. "Lectures are a scam," he said, waving his cigarette dismissively. 40 of us sitting there like fools, copying down whatever the professor says. It's easier to read a book. I'm not a human photocopying machine. "How will you pass the exam if you don't go to the lectures and make notes?" I said. "I'll borrow notes off someone," he said. "You, in fact. I'll read your notes and then I'll be able to jump through their stupid hoops." I didn't really know what to say to him. I sat back in Ed's chair, a ridiculously old and stained leather thing that he'd got from a second-hand shop, and my gaze happened to settle on a little desk that stood at the side of the room. An old-fashioned alarm clock stood there, in a state of disassembly. "What's the deal with that?" I said, nodding towards it. "An investigation of time," he said. "I'm looking for time in its innards." "And have you found it?" I said, trying to detect some sign of levity in his features, but finding none. "No," he said, disconsolately. "I count that day really as the end of the friendship that I had known with Ed, the friendship that had sustained me through the difficult first year at university. I couldn't relate to the new, slightly disjointed, bitter version of Ed, and a lot of what he said didn't seem to make much sense. He also seemed to be becoming increasingly paranoid, and he began to ruminate a lot on the overreach of intelligence agencies. Even so, we continued to meet sporadically, mostly at his flat. Every time I saw him, his mental state seemed to have declined further. His eyes were continually bloodshot, and his face grew steadily more pale, but he himself denied that there was anything wrong with him, or even unusual about him. He began to obsess over the topic of what he called obliteration. That is, the possibility of removing oneself from existence via an instantaneous and total disassembly of all of one's cells. This he referred to as shedding the human form, which he increasingly seemed to regard as a kind of impediment. To what, exactly, was very unclear. I was of course convinced that all this was due to the pernicious effects of Professor B's experiments. Making no headway with Ed himself, I decided to go and share my concerns with Professor B, a man for whom I had frankly conceived something of a loathing, although I had seen him only once. I found him one day in his office at the psychology lab. When I knocked, he boomed, "Come," at me, and I went in to find him dangling a mouse by its tail above a terrarium. He glanced at me as I stepped into the room, and again noticed the shock on my face. "I'm just feeding Freddy," he said. "Freddy will only eat live meat. He's very discerning, quite unlike us humans." Freddy was some species of unspeakable lizard. As I watched, Freddy's jaws locked onto the terrified mouse, and he wolfed it down whole. Professor B watched it with a satisfied expression on his face, a face which people might have called handsome, but for the absence of any trace of normal human warmth upon it. "What do you want?" he said, abruptly. "I want to talk to you about Ed Y," I said. "He's enrolled in your study." "Yes, I know Ed," he said. "A very promising young man. What about him?" I had expected Professor B to invite me to sit down and to sit down himself, but nothing of the sort occurred. He only continued to gaze at the lizard with a revolting expression, so I decided to plough on and get to the point. You'll probably think me cowardly when I tell you how the conversation went. Yes, I should have been more forceful. In my defence, I can only say that I was a mere second-year student, and he was the great Professor B, and I had already had to sum up absolutely all my courage to even go and talk to him at all. "I feel that your study may be having a deleterious effect on his health," I said. "Oh, you feel that, do you?" said the professor, still gazing at the repulsive lizard. "Yes, I'm worried about him," I said. "So you thought you'd come here and criticise my work as a way of dealing with your anxiety?" he said. My heart sank at this unexpectedly unpleasant turn in the conversation. No, I stammered. "I don't want to criticise your study. I'm just saying I don't think he's doing too well." "He's not doing too well," he repeated in a mocking tone of voice, like one child making fun of another in the playground. "Did you hear that, Freddy? Our young aspiring Sigmund Freud here has decided Ed isn't doing too well and blames me for it." "I'm not blaming you for it," I said. "Tell you what," he said. "Why don't you go and harass some other professor with your ridiculous accusations? Freddy and I are busy." I was starting to feel angry even though I was horribly nervous. I was fairly sure this was not how professors were supposed to talk to students. "All right, I'll tell you what I think," I said. "I think your machine is messing up his brain, and I think you should withdraw him from your study." At this he drew a long intake of breath and turned to face me. "How dare you," he said. "I'm 70 years of age, and I've been conducting studies for 20 years, and you dare to come here and tell me my own business? Get out." He was red in the face and looked as though he could barely contain his rage. What could I do? I left, shaking with a mixture of nerves and righteous anger. I was young and naive, but I knew Professor B's behaviour wasn't right. Still, what could I really do about it? I decided to ask around and find out if anyone knew to whom I might put in a complaint. I didn't see Ed for several weeks, and not for want of trying. He just never answered his buzzer, and I never saw him at lectures. I don't think he was attending them. Ed's flat was on the second floor, so the door buzzer was really the only way I had of contacting him, short of dropping notes through the letterbox, which I also tried. Eventually I resorted to throwing pebbles at his window, and finally, one dark evening, he opened the window and, from the dimly lit recesses of his flat, shouted me to come up. The door buzzed, indicating that it had unlocked. The state I found him in was unbelievable. He was lying prostrate on his sofa, having risen apparently only to let me in. By his side on the floor, within reach of his dangling arm, an ashtray overflowed with what looked like several days of intense smoking. His complexion was as pale as death, and looking upon it, I finally felt the full weight of that cliché. Most shocking of all, by far, were his eyes. They were intensely bloodshot, and I fancied I could see traces of blood at the corners. "What the hell has happened to you?" I said. "I don't know what you mean," he replied. "The state of you," I said. "You look close to death." He turned his head slowly to face me, and I gazed into what looked like the eyes of an Ebola victim. "On the contrary," he said, "I've never been better. I see things more clearly now." "What things?" I said. He inhaled deeply and slowly exhaled. Then he began to speak, slowly and painfully, as if summoning his last reserves of energy. "It's all a kind of simulation," he said. "It's not real." "What's not real?" I said. "This," he said, and he waved his right hand dismissively at, it seemed, the entire universe, before letting it fall heavily back onto his chest. "The mind creates it." He drew shakily on a cigarette with yellowed fingers. It was at that point that my attention, which had been arrested by the awful sight of Ed himself, wandered to the rest of the apartment. His desk and large parts of the floor were covered in an odd assortment of springs, metal parts, and bits of disassembled electronics. I recognised bits of the clock that I'd noticed previously, but now it had been joined by numerous other disassembled objects. "I was puzzled at first by the problem of other people," he said languidly. "Other people?" I said. "Suppose one writes a message and leaves it in a cave," he said. "He dies, and a century later some other person finds it. If everything is in the mind, including the cave and the message, then in whose mind did the message reside in the intervening years, when it was unseen by human eyes?" He broke into a fit of painful-sounding coughing. I realised one wall was entirely lined with bags of some chemical, adorned with warning symbols. "I wouldn't trouble yourself with such things if I were you," I said. "I know what the solution is now," he said, with a dreadful, ironic smile. "The professor helped me find it. You see, the only answer is that everything is in one single person's mind, and that person never truly dies." My eye was caught by some maps and newspaper clippings that adorned the wall above the desk. What was I looking at here? To what fearful end were these odd furnishings directed? Was there any coherent end in it at all, or was it only symptoms of mental disease? "Whose mind would that be?" I said distractedly. "Mine, of course," he said, and he burst into a fit of unhinged giggling. "There is only me," he said. "I am immortal. I am the creator of it all. I am God." "You're not God," I said. He continued to laugh quietly, puffing another cigarette which he lit from the first. "Ed, what's all this stuff for?" I said. Still he only laughed, lips pressed together as if to stop the smoke escaping. Behind the other armchair, the one I wasn't sitting on, there was a large parcelled up object propped against the wall, consisting of thick folded rubbery plastic, like a rolled up tent or tarpaulin. It had a brand name on it, and I later discovered it was probably an inflatable boat. "What are the chemicals for, Ed?" I said. "You're nothing but a ghost in a dream," he said. "If I were to disappear, you'd disappear. The question is, how can I truly disappear? Is obliteration possible? How can one access obliteration?" I wasn't able to get any sense out of him. I decided to try to talk to the university authorities, although it wasn't clear to me who, if anyone, might be in authority over Professor B, but the university certainly had senior administrative staff, and I thought I might talk to one of those. After making some inquiries, it emerged that probably the person I needed to talk to was the course coordinator. No one could tell me the name of the course coordinator, but people assured me she existed and one could take complaints to her. I managed to make an appointment at the administrative building on North Street, and I duly turned up there, about a week after my unsettling meeting with Ed, to express my concerns. The course coordinator turned out to be a severe-looking woman with tight grey curls and round spectacles. "What can I do for you?" she said, motioning me to sit. She herself sat behind a cheap-looking fake wooden desk. On the wall behind her were numerous posters depicting happy students being awarded degrees or asking questions in lectures and whatnot. "My friend Ed is enrolled in a brain study being performed by Professor B," I replied. "Professor B is a great man," she said, and for a moment her expression seemed to soften slightly, only to abruptly harden again. "No doubt," I said, "but his study is having a very bad effect on my friend." "I see," she said. "If you have concerns about the study, the proper person to take the matter up with is Professor B," she said. "This doesn't sound like a matter for the university administration." "I've tried that," I said. "And?" she said. "Well, he was quite dismissive," I replied. "I'm sure Professor B knows best how his study is affecting his test subjects," said the woman. "I've been terribly worried about Ed," I said. "He looks ill." "Has he seen a doctor?" said the woman. "No," I said. "He doesn't think there's anything wrong with himself, but he's clearly deteriorating." "Are you a doctor?" said the woman. "Of course not," I said. "Then how are you fit to judge the state of his health?" said the woman. I was so taken aback that for a moment I couldn't find my words. She started talking again before I could organise my thoughts. "From what you're saying," she said, "it sounds like it may be you who has the problem. We have a counselling service which I can enrol you in, if that would be helpful." "The problem is with Ed, not me," I said. "You seem anxious," she said. "I am anxious," I said. "My friend is deteriorating practically by the day." "Mr. Hurst, it seems to me that you are a very anxious person, and that you have come in here today with an axe to grind against Professor B," she said. "There's really nothing I can do for you, and I would suggest you avail yourself of the student counselling services." Try as I might, I could make no headway with her, and I left her a few minutes later, quite shaken up. 2 weeks passed during which I didn't see Ed, and I agonised about what to do. Some of my other friends said I should go to the police, but the police in the town of N had a reputation for, well, ignorance and rudeness, and that hardly seemed a good idea. Then things came to a head of their own accord. The managers of the little student estate where I was living came looking for me to tell me that Ed had gone missing. I was known to be one of his few friends, and they wanted to know if I had any idea as to his whereabouts. Of course, I didn't. They said the police might want to talk to me the following day. I don't know why it came to me only then, but after they had left, I sat for a while on my bed, gazing out the window, and I recalled some news report of a terrorist making bombs from fertilizer. Then a penny dropped in my mind, or half dropped. Couldn't Ed be making some kind of bomb with all that stuff in his flat? But I couldn't see where the inflatable boat would fit into it. That train of thoughts made me sit up pretty sharpish. I didn't want to risk getting Ed into trouble by telling the police, since I could easily have been barking up completely the wrong tree, but I thought I ought to go and at least see if I couldn't locate Ed. If he wasn't in his flat, I thought he might be walking along the town's northern beach, which was usually fairly deserted, and it had been a favourite haunt of ours before he'd gone weird. By then it was about 6 in the evening and the sky was almost already dark. I set out for Ed's flat, thinking I'd go and throw stones at his window, in case he was in there but wasn't answering his door. Later on I found out that the police had already broken into his flat and found him absent, but at the time I had no way of knowing that. When I arrived at his flat, I was at least relieved to find he hadn't blown the whole place to pieces. After ringing the buzzer, I threw a pebble at the window and I was standing there hoping he'd answer when there was a tremendous bang from somewhere a little way off to the east. I began to walk in the direction the sound had come from, slowly at first, then breaking into a run as my fevered thoughts fed my fears. As I neared the source of the noise, its location became obvious on account of the people running towards it, including police cars and fire engines, and other people hurrying away from it, afraid of further explosions, I suppose. When I arrived, I found the ruins of a house. A woman was standing looking at it from a safe distance, a baby in her arms, and another child clutching at her skirt. "What happened?" I asked her. "It's the house of Professor B," she said. "We live 3 doors down. They're saying it's probably gas related." Just then, there was another enormous bang, but distant enough as to echo and reverberate like thunder. "Oh my God," said the woman, "another one." The second explosion turned out to have taken place in the psychology lab, where Professor B had performed his work. Professor B himself was found in the wreckage of his house, blown to pieces. Both explosions were attributed, as you may know, to chemicals stored improperly by Professor B for use in his work. They say Ed was killed in the second explosion, in the psychology lab, but his family have uncovered many significant anomalies in the coroner's report and the police reports. When Ed's belongings were returned to his family, several pages were missing from a journal he'd kept, but the journal demonstrated an obsession with suicide. But not just suicide, with what he called obliteration or dissolution. He had wanted to find a way of instantly dissolving himself, scattering his atoms to the winds. The inflatable boat was also missing from the belongings returned to his family, and the machine parts, and the bags of fertilizer or whatever chemicals it was that I'd seen. I'm certain, or as certain as I can be, that Ed caused those explosions. Precisely what his feelings really were towards Professor B, I don't know, but he wanted the professor and his work destroyed. I'm sure of it. As for Ed himself, certainly it's possible that he might have destroyed himself in the second explosion, but considering all the questions that have been raised about that, it's also possible that he may have made off on his boat and the authorities somehow wanted to cover it up for some reason. What do I really think happened? I think he rowed out to sea and, as he probably would have put it, obliterated himself with explosives. I have no proof, but putting everything together, it's the only thing that really makes sense. Professor B wasn't a nice man, but he didn't deserve his fate. On the other hand, I'm convinced he was the ultimate architect of it. You've been listening to Science Horror. My name's John. Thank you so much for listening. As you may have guessed, one of the inspirations for this story was none other than Ted Kaczynski, Mr. Unabomber. In his case, however, his victims were entirely innocent, but he was apparently the victim of some very unpleasant experiments, in which he was encouraged to write about his hopes and dreams, and a professor then completely tore them apart. Some say he was also experimented on with LSD. The case of Igaz Moniz also sprang to mind. He ended up paraplegic after one of the people he had lobotomized shot him in the spine. I also had in mind the very tragic case of tech executive Erin Valenti, who was found dead in her car after making a strange phone call where she apparently said, "It's all a game, it's a thought experiment, we're in the Matrix." If you like this story, do consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And comments are always appreciated. And not only because the comments help me with the YouTube algorithm, but also because I'm just interested to hear what you think of my stories. Thanks again, and do join me again next week I don't know what story I'm going to be reading next week, so I haven't written it yet. I'm thinking about writing a story about a future Earth where the planet's cooled down because the sun has basically all but disappeared and people are surviving in underground volcanic vents, but I might change my mind. Anyway, do join me again for that. That should be out, whatever it is, on Monday of next week. And until next time, have a good week and sleep well.